Hey everybody, and welcome to week 1 of class. If you've not yet had an opportunity to watch some of the introduction content that I have for you, please be sure to do that. Again, my name is Professor Scott Keys, and I will be your instructor for this course. But hopefully by this point, that's already been made known to you. Again, hopefully you've watched that introduction video and you've looked through the syllabus. If you've not yet done those things, please stop this video right here before moving on and acquaint yourself with that content, because again, it's super important that you understand what the policies, procedures, and basic structure of this course is going to be. So if you have done that, continue on with the video. If not, pause this, move on to the other stuff, then come back and finish this off. So what I'm going to do for you in this video, which is what I do in a number of videos throughout this course, is I'm going to provide for you an overview of what we're going to be doing this week, as well as kind of a mini lecture, just to sort of set the baseline of information that you will be looking at. So for this week, we're going to be looking at the latter part of the 19th century, and there's a lot of different things going on in the United States during this period, from roughly 1877 up through the early 1900s, and I mean like early turn of the century 1900s. And because, of course, this class is accelerated, again, we're cramming a whole lot of content in just over 4 weeks. This material is going to come at you just a little bit quickly, all right? So for this week, we're going to be looking in at 4 specific topics. The first of these topics is known by historians as the Gilded Age. And the Gilded Age was a time in American history where you begin to see the rise of big corporations. You begin to see the boom of the Industrial Revolution, or what historians call the Second Industrial Revolution. It is a time of great wealth and prosperity for a select few individuals, including men like Andrew Carnegie and J.P. Morgan and a host of others. Vanderbilt and Rockefeller all come to mind, right? And a select few folks were able to make millions and millions of dollars with their respected industries, right? When we think about Rockefeller, we think about Standard Oil, or when we think about J.P. Morgan, right? We're talking about banking. Even J.P. Morgan is still present on banking documents to this day, particularly if you bank with Chase. Okay, and so during this Gilded Age, you see the rise of major corporations, and you begin to see the development of new organizational structures, such as vertical integration and horizontal integration. Both of these were techniques used by various folks to try and maximize the amount of profits that they would accrue in their respective industries. Part of this process, particularly Rockefeller was very successful at this, was establishing monopolies, buying up other corporations or simply putting them out of business. And basically he created a monopoly on oil. And of course other captains of industry, or robber barons, depending upon how you want to talk about these folks, they made a lot of money. And this is what we think of when we talk about something being gilded. If you're familiar with the term gilded, it really is talking about something that has very little value, and then you would give it a fine kind of layer of thin gold, so that if you were to take a look at this very worthless piece of thing, what you would see is this kind of golden layer, and so you might think that it has a lot of value, okay? During the Gilded Age, which was a term coined by Mark Twain, by the way, during the Gilded Age, those who were looking at the United States saw men like Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan and the Vanderbilts, and they see these mansions that they're building on Millionaire Row, right? And the American dream is that anybody can become a Rockefeller. But the truth of the matter is that underlying a lot of that golden veneer, right, is the truth of a lot of poverty. And indeed, I believe that the term Gilded Age is an appropriate term for this period, simply because on the top, it looks as if anybody can become wealthy. But not everybody does. In fact, the great majority of people do not. Jacob Riis, who was a muckraker, we'll be talking more about them, but he is an individual who exposed the reality that not everybody was living like the Rockefellers. Indeed, there was a great deal of poverty, people living in tenements. Jacob Riis wrote a book called How the Other Half Live, and he exposed to New York and the world in large that these tenements were places where people were literally dying. There was no natural light, there was no indoor plumbing, there was a lack of food and opportunity. And the reality is that during the Gilded Age, politicians didn't run the political scene. Corporations did. And indeed, the period of history following the Gilded Age, which is called the Progressive Era, we'll be talking about that as well this week. The Progressive Era was an attempt to address many of the problems that was created by the Gilded Age. Things like unhazardous working conditions, child labor, right? In many ways, the Gilded Age demonstrates large free market capitalism run amok, where there is no restraints on the free market and people just do whatever it is they're going to do. The Progressive Era, by contrast, and we're going to be talking about that as well this week, the Progressive Era was made up of a group of men and largely women as well who attempted to address the social problems and the business practices that were created by the Gilded Age. So one of the things that we're going to be looking at this week are a series of photographs by Louis Hine. Louis Hine photographed child labor and the horrendous nature of child labor as a way to expose to American society just how horrible working conditions were. I mean, during the Gilded Age, you don't have regulations on child labor. You don't have minimum wage. You don't have regulated working hours and regulated working days. And so what the progressives attempted to do was to try to bring government back into control and to regulate these types of concerns, to bring an end to child labor, to try to bring in minimum wage, and to try to bring in regulations. One of the things that you maybe have seen in businesses today is that it states over many doors, this door must be kept open and unlocked at all business hours. And the reason for that was because there was a fire at the Triangular shirt factory. A fire broke out. And because of the fact that there were no regulations, what the employers had done was lock the doors from the outside so that their employees couldn't leave, so that they would always be forced to work and be effective and productive. Well, of course, once the building caught fire, they couldn't get out and they leaped to their death or they burned up. And so regulation said, hey, look, there's problems created by free market capitalism run amok, where the government is really engaged in a laissez-faire, that is hands-off approach. We, as progressives, they thought that they wanted to come in and address some of these problems. Indeed, one of the things that really punctuates the progressives is that they wanted larger government. They wanted greater democracy. That is, they wanted more people to be involved in the political process. In fact, one of the things that you have if you live in California is a practice known as the referendum, the recall, and the initiative. This is, and these are accomplishments of the progressives, where they basically said, hey, if the legislature is not passing laws that you as the people would like to have passed, well, then you can put an initiative on the ballot. You have to get enough signatures, but you can put an initiative on it, and you can try and get that passed by the will of the people. You can also recall political officials that you don't like. In fact, in California, we've done this as well. Governor Gray Davis was recalled. And this is really evidence of progressivism attempting to try and give more control to the people. Indeed, progressives wanted to bring in experts and try to scientifically manage how society functioned and how it worked in order to maximize and be efficient. And the Progressive Era is, again, really in response to that Gilded Age. They want to address the problems that they find. Now, the truth of the matter is one of the interesting things is that when you think about progressive or progress, you might regard progressive thinking today as being more oriented towards social justice. The truth of the matter is that many of the progressives of the early 1900s were not very progressive when it came to issues of race. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about this week, in addition to the Gilded Age and the progressive movement, is immigration. And many of the progressives were not fan of immigrants. In fact, it's during the progressive era, during the 1920s, specifically in 1924, where the United States is going to pass an act known as the Immigration Quota Act. And basically what this did is it set a limit of the types of immigrants that we would allow into the country. And just as a quick background, historians have sort of identified two different waves of immigration that occurred in the 19th and early 20th century. And in the 1800s, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, they had what historians called old immigration. And old immigration would be people from Western Europe, places like Ireland and Germany and Scotland and England. They tended to be more Protestant in their thinking, albeit the Irish were not as much Protestant as they were Catholic, but these folks tended to be more Protestant. They tended to be English speaking. They tended to be more inclined to Western institutions such as religion and education and values. And so for the most part, although discrimination did occur among these old immigrants, the shift to what historians call new immigrants, they were very different. New immigrants tended to not be white. They tended to be from Southern and Eastern Europe, places like Italy and Russia. Jews came. And because the new immigrants were not as typical of Anglo-American institutions as some would like, there was a lot of fear and anxiety about having the hordes of immigrants coming in and destroying American institutions. Even the Chinese found themselves ridiculed and ostracized. In fact, in 1882, the United States passes the Chinese Exclusion Act, not allowing any Chinese to come in at all. But I say all that is simply to make the point that in addition to the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, we are also going to talk about immigration. Most immigrants who came into the United States came in by two stations. One would be Ellis Island. That's your very typical, prototypical notion of immigrants as they come into the the latter part of the 19th century, early 20th century. Right, they're coming in, they're on their boat, they stop in Jersey, they get off, they go through Ellis Island, and boom, they make it into the United States, assuming they didn't get sent back. But there's another way station where folks came in, and that's in San Francisco. It's called Angel Island, and that mainly processed Japanese and Chinese immigrants. But unlike Ellis Island, Angel Island was in many ways a prison. Ellis Island processed upward about 5,000 people a day, and for the most part, people were brought in, allowed in. At Angel Island, the Chinese were held there as prisoners. In fact, if you go into Angel Island, you can see where in the prison cells the Chinese have inscribed poems talking about how horrid the conditions were. So both were immigration processing centers, but the realities of life for them were very, very different. Okay, and so this kind of fear of immigrants, the fear that they could not assimilate into American society, the fear that they would destroy American institutions, the argument that they were going to depress American wages because they were going to take jobs from white, God-fearing Americans, and they're going to do that for less money. All of those ideas culminate to bring about the Quota Act of 1924, as well as other immigration acts. And this is a belief system. This fear of immigrants is what we call nativism. It is a nativistic point of view where you are fearful of immigrants and you're fearful that they're going to destroy your country. Okay, you're going to be doing some reading of a gentleman by the name of Josiah Strong, who makes some very interesting comments about what immigrants were and what they were about. Okay, the last topic that we're going to be looking at this week is imperialism, and imperialism is basically, for lack of a better definition, the process where a stronger country begins to imperialize or begins to take over what you might regard as weaker nations. And in the United States, we don't like to think of the United States as being an empire, right? We wouldn't imperialize, we wouldn't control and conquer other people. But in fact, we did just do that. We did it throughout the 19th century. Except instead of calling it imperialism, we refer to it as manifest destiny. This idea that God had provided this obvious destiny for the United States, that we were somehow exceptional, our institutions were exceptional, that is, white American Anglo society was superior or better than, allegedly better than other groups of folks, and so we of course stretched from sea to shining sea. And of course by the 1900s, we have conquered all of the North American hemisphere. So now we have to look to other locations. And there are a number of reasons why some Americans wanted to imperialize other countries. For example, there's an industrial revolution going on. There's an expansion in the market economy. So one way that you can expand who you can sell your goods to is to have colonies or simply, exert your control over weaker nations. There were racial beliefs that American society and its institutions were better, superior. In fact, during the Philippine-American War, which was a 3-year conflict that followed the Spanish-American War, and we'll be talking about that this week as well, but there's this idea given by the president, William McKinley, that Filipinos were not capable of self-government. That is, they couldn't control themselves. They couldn't govern themselves. What they needed was for the United States to come in and govern for them. But there's also embedded in that a strong white supremacist racial kind of mindset that suggested that what the United States was doing was bringing civilization to a weaker, inferior people. I don't believe that that's the case. I don't believe that that was true, but those were some of the justifications. And as a result of American imperialism, the United States is going to get involved in a number of different events. The Spanish-American War, 1898 for sure. That's a very short conflict. The idea was to go to war against Spain in order to free Cuba of Spanish colonialism, which in some regards that's what happened to a degree. But the United States gains imperial possessions. We take control of the Philippines. We take possession of Puerto Rico and Guam. So we can see that that's kind of a more violent example of American imperialism. There were some folks who definitely believed that imperialism was wrong. They believed that imperialism defiled and violated the tenets of American democracy and the values that the United States stood for. We have to understand that you could be 100% against imperializing the Philippines, but still think that Filipinos are inferior, right? It's not so much that Mark Twain or Andrew Carnegie, who were anti-imperialists, it's not necessarily that they necessarily thought that Filipinos and whites were equal, albeit Mark Twain may have. But definitely they believed that we can't talk about self-government and then impose our government and our will and our institutions on other people. That makes us a hypocrite. And so you're definitely going to want to talk and think through some of these different arguments for both pro-imperialism and anti-imperialism, okay? All right, guys, I could literally go on and on and on. I only even scratched just a little bit of the surface to cover some of that, but I know that you've got reading to do, you've got some videos to watch, you've got questions to answer, lots of things going on. So I'm going to leave that here. What I just want to remind you is that you do have your writing assignments due this week, and basically what you're going to have is each week you will answer 3 questions. You might have more than 3 options available to you, but you're only going to answer 3. And each one of your answers needs to be at least 1 page minimum, no more than 2 pages. So minimally, each week, you're at least going to submit 3 different answers, okay? No more than 6 pages total, no less than 3 pages total. Obviously, that makes sense. If you give 1 page per question, that's 3 pages. If you do 2 pages, that's 6. Obviously, basic math, okay? Now, when you submit these to Canvas, please make sure that you submit them as 1 document and not as 3 separate documents. I don't want to have to open up 3 separate documents. It's much easier for me just to be able to do it all in one. So, if you have any questions, let me know. I'll get back to you. Otherwise, I will leave you, as I always do, with go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you. Live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a blessed week, guys.